Breaking the cycle to step forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris and Beverley Ann.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward podcast with myself, Chris and my co-host
Beverley Ann. Hello everyone.
And we have the lovely Fay Maxted OBE with us for her second podcast, because last time, jokingly, she was too busy. And after telling us what she did on a day-to-day basis, we truly get that she is a busy lady. So Fay, welcome back.
I'm really pleased to be back, Chris. And Bev, it's nice to be here.
So we went through your last podcast because we wanted to pick up on some of the conversations that we touched upon, and we want to look at certain areas more in depth. And one of the questions that I wanted to put to you was, you shared with us that you were abused at an early age. You also shared with us that you didn't really have any formal sexual educate or sex education until secondary school. And there has been a lot of people speaking up in the media, parents who do not want their children to have sex education until secondary school, or not at all. So why is it, Faye, important for this to happen, this sex education, relationship education, to happen at an earlier age?
I think it's absolutely crucial. And my despair really when I hear people arguing against it. And, you know, I'm not wanting and not advocating that we have full-blown sex education for 5-year-olds, but I think there is a way of speaking to children as young as that, and supporting them to really reach out if there is something happening that they're worried about or don't understand. I mean, back in the day, for me, it was a very different environment then. You know, there was clearly, obviously, no internet, no smartphones. I was blissfully unaware until sex education in secondary school that what had happened to me was sexual abuse. And that might seem, you know, bizarre these days, but that's how it was. And I can remember the moment when it dawned on me, and that awful, crushing feeling of, oh my goodness. And as you know, 11 or 12, trying to take that on board and being too ashamed to tell anybody, and feeling so crippled by guilt for years after that. So I really strongly believe that children do need to have information that they can use. The other thing I would say is, if parents don't want schools to step in and provide sex education in a safe environment, then their kids are going to learn in the playground on smartphones, and they're going to learn in the worst possible way, because it's going to be hardcore pornography of the kind that most people would be, you know, thoroughly disgusted and shocked at. So if that's the choice, I would much sooner be talking to children in a safe environment with people who are trained, obviously, very carefully and specially to do that. Otherwise, we're failing our children.
And for me, I just don't think that parents understand the danger that children and young people are facing these days. And I also, how do we take parents on this journey with us? Because we in the sector, us as survivors, we know about these dangers. We're being told day in, day out from survivors that they just wish they had the education earlier, so that they could have been empowered to do something, even though it's not their responsibility, you know, to know about it so they could maybe share it and get an intervention or get support earlier. We hear it all of the time. So how do we take parents along on this journey that is so needed?
I think we've absolutely got to educate them about what is happening otherwise on their children's phones. And, you know, it seems really commonplace now for children under 10 to be given phones that can access the internet. I think And I think children are really, really smart at, you know, moving around anything that parents put in place to stop them.
Yeah.
And so are abusers, and they will use all the kinds of apps that kids love, TikTok and WhatsApp and stuff like that. That's what they target, because that's what abusers do. And they find ways of impersonating other young people, or, you know, presenting as someone who's not a risk. And children get drawn in. And if parents don't understand that, then we have to really make sure that they do understand. And that might mean, you know, giving them some really harsh things to hear about what their kids have access to. You know, and we hear that kids as young as 7 or 8 have seen pornography, and pornography, online pornography, is not the same as Playboy magazine. It's not like the, you know, in the old days when there was a top shelf in the newsagents,
Yeah.
which, you know, these days would be seen as really mild and not even classed as pornography, I think.
Mm.
It's not like
Yeah.
that. We are
Yeah.
talking about the very worst degrading acts, usually multiple men against women. I'm sorry, I don't mean to go into
Yeah.
graphic detail here, but people do need to understand that it's not normal sex. If it was,
Yeah.
I'd be less worried. If it was a nice, loving relationship, showing something that's pleasurable, that would be different. It's not. It's not. We're talking about women being degraded. And very quickly, if you're watching that kind of material, drawn into child sexual abuse material online. And there, you know, that then draws people further and further in.
The other thing is, which people, I think, or parents as a whole, let's be honest, there's this, if you were to say, would you let your child, you know, a young child under the age of 10 these days, go down to the local park on their own? Most parents would say, absolutely not. And if you followed up and said, why not? Well, they wouldn't be safe. There'd be strangers around. However, you know, it's that safe place. Oh, I know when my child is, they're in their bedroom, they're, you know, they're on the laptop. And it's as if it's a safe environment. Oh, they're only playing a game.
Yeah.
And before we know it, you know, how many people actually, I mean, I knew a young person, they were 5 and they had an iPhone for their birthday.
Yeah. I mean, I would absolutely ban iPhones for anybody under 16. And, you know, I know there has been talk of doing that. And some schools actually have introduced that, so that, you know, people can have the old clunky phones where you could text and take calls, but that was it. And what else do children need?
Absolutely.
And if you're going to allow your child to go online, unless you're going to sit with them and watch, even if you're in the same room, you know, and you're not watching that screen, you don't know who they're talking to. You
No.
don't know what the conversations are. You don't know the code words that are being used. It really is risky. It's not the same as allowing your child to go to the park. It's like letting them play on the train tracks.
Yes.
Wow.
And this is
Yeah.
without creating fear. It's about raising awareness, because once we have a knowledge and awareness, then we can ask the next questions. Okay, what can I do to help protect my child whilst they're still growing up safely?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Get the balance.
it's got to be talking to your kids and making sure that they can access that information. And I think, like Chris said earlier, you know, the last thing you want to do is make children responsible for their own safety. But knowledge is power. You know, if you know something's wrong, then it takes away that guilt, and that makes it easier to tell somebody.
Absolutely.
So we're going to draw a
Chris.
line under that question there, because I've got lots to get through. So picking up on signs and symptoms, is there a definitive list of sign and symptoms in your experience, Fay? Because there's a lot of talk of, oh yeah, if we only know the signs and symptoms, we'll be able to do this.
I think it's like anything where you start talking about what are the definitive things around this, people are so different. There is huge variation, and there can be variation. So it's about being sensitive to the different ways that children and young people can be impacted. So for some, it might be that they withdraw. For others, they become the class clown and disruptive. Some children will overeat, others will starve themselves. You just have to be aware for changes in behaviour.
Yeah.
I think that's the main indicator. If you're
Yeah.
working with children, you will notice when a child does something which is different to how they've usually been. And that's the point, I think, that people need to be questioning and wondering, why is that? What's happening? There might be, there might be an explanation which is understandable. Children face other traumas like bereavement or their parents having difficulties. But I think if you're sensitive to those changes, then you can follow that up. And I think it's there that people need to have the confidence to do that, and to really feel that they are justified. Sorry, in
Don't worry.
in really following up and questioning what's happening. And we're talking about potentially something that will impact on a child's life for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
How much more important does that have to be before people are prompted to really think we need to do something? We need to have a better way of.
But I think lots of professionals are saying, yeah, but what are the signs? What are the symptoms? And then we can really keep an eye open for them. And there are even some survivors that say, yeah, there is a list. You just need to watch out for this. And there's other survivors like ourselves that says, actually, it is so varied, but look out for the changes. So, it's not always detectable, is it?
It's not. I mean, and you can look at things like, maybe a child will start shoplifting. They might start bullying their peers. They might be disruptive in class. Their grades might slip. They might go from, a top class student to suddenly the bottom of the class. They might overwork. They might be reluctant to go home. They're all changes from what you wouldn't expect, and it's the change, I think, that makes the difference.
Beverley, have you got anything to add?
Yes. Excuse me, I was just thinking about that, because as we know, you and I have both said different things. For me, I personally, when I look back, reflect on my own way as well, I wonder if it's not necessarily sexual education, if it's about giving children permission to tell you when they feel uncomfortable. And I know we've touched on this before, Chris, and we've spoken about this, but I know for me, because it was my dad, society was telling me that, you do as adults tell you, you respect your dad. Whereas I think when we think of sex education, should it be called something else? But within that education, educating our young people to say that this doesn't feel right. And it's okay to speak to other adults and say, I feel uncomfortable. So that there isn't necessarily a sign that there's a child's being abused, as we know, because I didn't show any signs, and I showed it differently to you. But I think, as we've said before about conversations, if we create that space, that it's okay to say, if it feels funny, go and tell someone. Have I made that clear, or have I come completely off kilter there?
No, I think, you're just saying that there should be safe spaces for children as part of a cultural change, so that they can come forwards and explain that something doesn't feel right for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fay, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think I think as part of wider education, that would be really valuable. I think on its own, I'm not sure it would work for,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
for most children. I think as part of something which really educates around the fact that your own body is yours and you are
Mm-hmm.
allowed to, to say if someone touches it and that's not what you want or not what
Yeah.
you want, and that it's wrong for an adult to touch a child in that way.
Yeah.
So that it's really clear. It doesn't matter which adult it is. It doesn't matter who it is, because we know that offenders come in all shapes and sizes and sexes and genders.
Yeah.
So, in the same way that we can't have a list of what are the signs and symptoms, we can't have a list of who are the perpetrators, because they're all over the place.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to move on to the next topic, and it really is yin and yang. We just talked about something quite heavy. We touched upon self-care last time, and you were both speaking about these are things that are just for you. Yeah. And it's important to maintain that as a survivor, because it's part of your ongoing self-care. But there are many victim and survivors, and even some that I'm working with at the moment, Faye and Bev, that are so angry that they even have to do this. And some don't even know what this looks like, what it feels like. So when we're talking about, oh, just go and do that, or just try and do that, what, they're
Yeah.
like, and they might sit in front of you and go, right, I understand what you're saying, it is a good idea and I want to do it, but then they just go on self-destruct mode, literally. Like one particular individual was like, I'm trying healthy eating because I know I need to, but then just goes and does the complete opposite. What is that, and how can they break that?
I think I think you have to strip it right back
Yeah.
and think about why should I be bothered with self-care?
Mm-hmm.
You have to really start from a point of liking yourself, loving yourself, and knowing that you are worth it and
Yeah.
valued, so that you are worth the self-care, whatever it is. And it might be watching a funny program on TV, it might be reading a book. It doesn't have to be something, sort of out of this world. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be just the basic things that lots of people take for granted because they've not experienced the kind of trauma that disrupts
Yeah.
the ability to really think of yourself as a valuable person in this world that deserves to have self-care and deserves to look after themselves.
So would you say
Absolutely.
those that are on quite a destructive path, even though they can see that it's going to be beneficial, but they do the opposite? Do you think that the work then is the self-love and the self-esteem and the self-confidence? And do you think that you're only going to get that through therapy, or do you think you could do that by yourself? I don't have all the answers.
There's quite a few questions packed into that
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
I think I would say if someone's anger is getting in the way of them looking after themselves and being kind
Yeah.
to themselves, then the anger they're feeling, which is absolutely justified, is just going in
Mm-hmm.
the wrong direction. It
Yeah.
needs directing outwards. They've got every right to be angry. They've
Yeah.
been failed, and they've suffered things that they shouldn't have done. But at the moment, the anger that they feel has nowhere else to go except towards themselves. And that really breaks my heart, because it's another insult to them, it's another
Yeah.
damage to them. So it's about redirecting that anger. And then once you can do that, if you can accept, and I think it does take a long time. It certainly took me decades to come to the realization that actually I wasn't guilty of anything. It wasn't
Yeah.
my fault. I didn't provoke it in any way, didn't ask for it, had no ability to control what happened. but it took a long time to feel like
Yeah.
that. And I had a lot of misunderstandings along the way of misinterpreting my power as a child. And I think as an adult, when you look back at yourself as a child, you don't see yourself and think of yourself as a child. You see yourself as you are now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you do something? Why did you go there? And it's wrong. I mean, you would not get a small child in front of you and question them about what they were doing when they were abused or why they allowed it to happen. You wouldn't do that in a million years.
Yeah.
So stop doing it to yourself and start targeting that anger at the right point. And now I'm not advocating that anger is acted out.
No, no. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
want to be clear about that. I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting people go and do anything about that,
Yeah.
but having that real understanding that, you know, you're hitting the wrong target at the moment.
Yeah, that was one of my issues that I dealt with through EMDR, and we spoke about that, Bev, haven't we, on a podcast?
Yeah. But also, anger is an emotion that often people don't recognize as a valid emotion.
Mhm.
And they're maybe, if they've expressed anger in different ways, they've been punished for it. And a lot of the time it gets suppressed, and people don't actually realize that they're angry because it's the norm.
Yeah.
And they acknowledge the shame and the guilt to themselves, not necessarily to anyone else. I look at myself when at one time the shame, the guilt, I carried on that. But the anger I didn't actually acknowledge. That was sort of pushed down, because if I ever said anything, I remember that speaking out became I'd be told off.
Yeah.
And even now I have to really work with my anger to find the words for my emotions and think about how I want to communicate it.
Yeah. In reality, anger is an amazing emotion. It's wonderful because it galvanizes people to do things. It fires them up to campaign. It fires them up to want to make changes. It fires them into specific professions and ways of working. It's, it gets a bad press. And I think it's because it always goes, or often goes, to the wrong target, but used in the right way.
Yeah.
People can't change what happened in the past, and it doesn't matter how angry you get, it's never going to change the past. But use energy to pay it forward and make a difference going forward, whether that's in your own life, in how you live your life, in how you look after yourself and how you are with people around you, or whether that's volunteering for a charity, whether it's doing, if going on, I don't know, marathons and raising funds for charity, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Use it.
Absolutely.
Beverley, did you want to ask a question?
Well, I would off my phone, but they've all I'm using my phone.
I will take charge then. Okay.
You're in the driving seat.
Your helpline, the Survivors Trust helpline, what are the 3 most common things or themes you are hearing all of the time?
Oh, a huge one is people not being able to get the support they need where they live. Another one is mental health issues, people with mental health issues, whether that's depression or anxiety, really struggling with finding the support they need.
Right.
And I think otherwise we have a huge number of return callers. And I think for them, it's about having a place where they can talk, where they can be accepted, where, they can come and talk about whatever's going on in their lives, and having a place where they can go if they can't find something nearby.
Okay.
There's no replacement for local services, but
And I always think, sorry, Chris, but I always think being in an environment, say peer-to-peer support, is so valuable, because it's being able to hear others and be able to think, oh, they're just like me. And And it gives a connection, because let's be honest, we do judge ourselves really harshly. But also when we do find a voice, even at the beginning, it's fear of what's going to happen. It's like, is this big explosion going to happen? And that's a big fear, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is. And it's the unknown. It's not knowing
Absolutely.
what will happen next, yeah.
Okay, tied to that question, the helpline question, the Survivors Trust, your charity, is the umbrella charity for 120 plus others. What are the 3 things that are currently topics of concern for your charities under your umbrella?
I would say the biggest concern at the moment is the government has a specific funding stream for rape and sexual abuse support services. We don't know what's happening beyond the end of March next year, so
wow,
a huge concern. So
mm-hmm.
We're getting to a point where I know organisations will be thinking, do we need to issue redundancy notices?
Wow.
How much have we got in reserves that will
Mm-hmm.
keep us going? Where else can we find funding? So that's a huge concern, and we just don't. And I was at a reception given by Yvette Cooper and Jess Phillips at the Home Office on Wednesday, and they were confirming their support for strategies they want to cut violence against women and girls by half in the next decade. And they were, confirming that's what they want to do, their support and how they want to help in terms of preventing violence against women and girls. But because it's a new government, because we don't know what's going to happen with the funding, it's still uncertain.
And why I put those 2 questions sort of together is that services like yours and the charities that are under your umbrella, they provide literal lifelines to victims and survivors. And we know that more and more are coming forwards, whether they're reporting to the criminal justice system is neither here nor there. The fact that they want help and support, as more and more is being reported on in the media, social media, more and more are coming to look for help, support, advice. And when you're being fed back from all of these different charities that their funding is unstable, it is really worrying for not only yourselves, but also for victims and survivors going forward. So we've got the government saying one thing, but the funding is not stable. It's not really good, is it?
The funding has never been enough. That's the difficulty. The demand is so high. Waiting lists are huge. In some areas, waiting not just 6 months, waiting a year, waiting 2 years sometimes. That's unconscionable when someone's reached a point of crisis, reaching out for help, and it could then be months or even years before they actually get the kind of support that they need. And we know from what survivors tell us that NHS services don't work for them in an awful lot of cases. So the voluntary sector carries the brunt of it.
And that's because of when you're voluntary, you are following what is right for your support that you want to be able to give, and you can be flexible and adaptable. Unfortunately, for large corporations such as the NHS, they don't have that ability, do they, Faye?
No, they don't. And very often, they might put a restriction on the number of counselling sessions someone can have. And that then can lead to a situation where someone just starts to build a level of trust and starts to open up about what's happened. And then that's it. That's the end of the sessions before they've ever had any chance to start to unpick the damage that it's caused to them and to start putting things right. So, we know that the vast majority of victims and survivors prefer longer term specialist counselling, but consistently they've been asking for that for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
And you know, we have a few agencies that are still able to provide that, but a lot of them have, because of the way they're commissioned, they've adjusted what they offer. And you know, it's occasionally now we hear from survivors calling the helpline who will say, well, you know, I've had all the sessions I can have. And it's like, did you have all the sessions you needed? It's
Yeah, that's two very different things.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it is ongoing, and Chris and I are very honest about it. We still have our own sessions. You know, it's part of a self-care package. Let's be frank.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the thing about the impact of it. It's not something that fades. Those memories are, you know, stay clear. And if they're, you know, if they're triggered by something, if something happens or you see something, then it can very easily come back with all the force that you originally felt. And you know, that does mean that you have to work, I think, as a survivor, you have to work at keeping yourself healthy, keeping yourself on an even keel. And if that means, you know, prioritizing self-care, if it means, you know, not watching the news sometimes, avoiding certain programs or films, then do that. Avoiding certain people sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, look after yourself, because it's an ongoing thing that you have to do.
So changing track again, what research would you like to see being done and why?
One of the things that I've always thought would be really useful is long-term research into the effectiveness of different interventions.
Okay.
Because I think people can get caught up in things that are easily evidenced, so things like CBT or DBT, or they get caught up in things that that make it difficult to go back to someone and say, how are you feeling now? Because, you know, it's an ethical consideration. So I would love to see something set up where people going into a service or into various services are asked to, if they can be contacted after they've been through all of the sessions that they need. And I would contact them a year after, 2 years after, 3 years after. And, you know, I have a feeling that people might benefit from a top-up session.
Yes.
You know, all the things that, you know, that you realize and understand as you're going through counseling, sometimes that dissipates over time. You know, you've got your life to live, you've got other pressures on you, and it can be that you fall back into old ways of thinking or old ways of coping or managing things. So I think, you know, people would benefit from, you know, a few top-up sessions just as a reminder. So I would love to see something structured like that, which is thought through, funded, ethically approved, so that people can be contacted after they've had whatever amount of sessions they're deemed, whether in whatever modality, whether it's, you know, EMDR, DBT, sexual violence counselling, any form of psychotherapy.
So for the funding bids that I just did, Faye, I had to prove the long-term impact of my program. And it was really, even though I was really worried about approaching my previous participants, because I didn't want to hear that they'd suffered any harm because of going backwards, like you've explained, but I was surprised by how it was a change for them in fulfilling their potential. So it was quite a nice blessing in disguise to see that long-term impact improvement. Obviously not for every participant, but for most. And that's all you can really hope for, because you can't, it's not about fixing people, but it's about helping them along the way to fulfilling their potential and being happier and being more at peace.
Yeah. And and I think the results, if you're finding that for some people one way of working doesn't work, maybe another one would, and
Yeah.
it's unpicking that and trying to find out, well, what is it that makes the difference?
Yeah.
And I do check back with clients as well, but I get their permission from the beginning.
Yeah, I
And
think really good.
it really does make a difference, because, and also call it mentoring, because after a while, we all need to be mentored in different ways. And
Yeah.
it's quite a nice approach, and it gives the person ability to check in with themselves. That's what I naturally do. I know, Chris, you follow up yourself anyway, but we need that sometimes, don't we? That safe space to continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your next question then, Chris?
So my next question was, it's almost putting Fay Maxted into the spotlight today, isn't it? Asking you different questions. Now, the term sexual violence and or abuse are often interchangeable, and one phrase is recognised by some people and not recognised by others. What do these terms mean to you? So sexual violence, sexual abuse, what do these terms mean to you? And do you know the history at all of these phrases whilst you've been working in this sector?
Yeah, I mean, when the Survivors Trust was first set up, the way we talked about the offences and things that had happened to people is we talked about rape and sexual abuse, or rape and childhood sexual abuse. So sexual violence was something that came in, I'm trying to remember when it was. It's maybe about 10 years ago or so. And I think it was, I don't know, I can't explain where it came from, but
No, that's fine.
really struggled with accepting it. And part of it is because for many people, for many survivors, the word violence doesn't really relate to what happened to them, or they don't feel that it relates to what happened to them, whether that's because of a grooming process or because of how they were sexually abused. And very many rapes do not involve violence. And so sexual violence didn't make sense, but it was how the government at the time was referring and defining it. So we've had to follow suit.
And I think round the world as well, they usually refer to it as sexual violence, but in the UK specifically, within this sector, it's often, as you said, rape and or sexual abuse. And many victims and survivors seem to identify with sexual abuse more as a phrase rather than sexual violence, because, as you said, not all victims and survivors feel like violence was used against them, and we often hear from different people, well, I love my mum, I love my dad, I love my uncle, I love my granddad. And even though they didn't like what happened to them, they still didn't feel that there was violence involved. And that's going to be hard for some people outside of the sector, outside of being a victim and survivor, to actually grasp and understand.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's such a complex area, complex topic, and I think for many victims and survivors, that certainly for me, when sexual violence did not make sense in the same way.
Yeah. And we're not saying either phrase is wrong or right. We're just exploring the phrases. Yeah.
I'm used to it now.
Yeah.
And
sorry.
when you think of the word sexual violence, what I was actually hearing, going through my mind, was sexual violation, because when I consider You know, it is a violation. It's a violation of your rights, your body, your, you know, I was going to say permissions, but when it's against a child, it's not about consent or permissions, but it is an absolute violation, and there's no coming back from it. So personally, I like the word sexual violation because I think it gives clarification, but it's like any communication, isn't it? It's how it's perceived and how it's perceived.
Yeah. Moving on, but along the same vein, in the last podcast, you said adult survivors get left by the wayside. You know, we have rape and sexual assault of adults, which is current. We have rape and sexual assault of children, that is current, and both of those seem to be dealt with. There's a better response to those two sections or sectors of people, children, but adult survivors of non-recent abuse in particular, we do fall down in all ways of being responded to. There's not enough funding, there's not enough emphasis put on us. What are your feelings around what I've just said, Faye? Do you still obviously do agree with that, because you said it and we do agree with what you're saying, but it's just coming back to that and highlighting that.
Yeah, and it makes me angry, Chris, and I think it's a miscarriage of justice, and it's unfair. And I think part of the problem is that adult survivors may be more likely to need and want longer term counselling. They may need longer term support. And, you know, if you think about the impact on a child's development as they grow up, and the damage that it can cause to relationships and abilities to form relationships and friendships and to thrive, you know, it's no wonder that adult survivors may well need that longer term therapy and support, but that costs money. And the cynical part of me thinks that's why it's not given the prominence that, for example, you know, we place on adult rape and sexual assault, or as you've said, you know, the recent rape and sexual assault of children.
Yeah.
Not that I think the response that they get is perfect either.
No.
I don't think it is.
And none of us are saying they're not a priority, because they're all a priority, but we are saying that the adult survivors of non-recent abuse, and we also know that only like 1 in 8 are recognised by statutory services anyway. So there's 7 out of 8 children who are currently being abused that are going to grow up as adults that are not known to services. So we're talking about that cohort of people not getting what they need. And then, you know, going on and becoming parents themselves potentially of the next generation. And that's what we're saying needs to be dealt with as well, equally amongst all of the other responses to the deserving victim and survivors of whatever is happened to them.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of ignorance, and I say ignorance in its truest form. You know, we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about education and awareness, but I feel that there's a lot of ignorance that people have around hearing an adult and what they perceive to be grown up, and that when they're talking about non-recent abuse, you know, the justification, we hear it so many times, that happened years ago. You should be over it by now. That stopped. That was a long time ago. And they have no understanding that, you know, it's like a film that plays all the time. It's always in the background, and your body is always responding to it because the triggers and doing its role in trying to keep you safe, because our body doesn't know a time difference. And I think it's some of that lack of education and awareness that we hear all these other messages. And I am going to say it, and I'm going to say it, the media are one of the worst for that. You know, the subliminal messages we hear coming back from that.
I think that's true, and I think it's it makes me think about when we first started meeting as a group to set up the Survivors Trust, and one of the things we wanted to do was to run an advert on national prime time TV. Obviously, this was before the sort of explosion of YouTube and stuff like that, and I do think some kind of advert would be useful. But what we wanted to do was to show ordinary people going about their lives, but overlaying that with the child, so that you could see the child inside as well.
Yeah.
And just raising that awareness that anyone could have been affected, and that they carry that with them. But we've never had enough funds to do anything like that. But that I would love to have something that really raises that awareness that when we're talking about adult survivors, we are talking about children. We're talking about children's experiences.
Yeah. So we're probably coming up to time, but Beverley will tell me in a moment. But just to finish off, can you give us an update on the Employers Against Abuse programme, the Check With Me First programme, Act on ICSA? So that might take you a good few minutes because there's a lot there. But just, from your last podcast, tell us what's going on with those 3 particular programs.
So with our Employers Against Abuse, I mean, we're running free workshops. Anyone can sign up to them. We're reaching out to employers, aiming to train people in the workforce so that they've got more understanding and awareness around sexual violence and sexual abuse and domestic violence and domestic abuse, so that not that they will provide support to people, because I think that would be quite scary, but and a lot of responsibility, but so that they will know where people can go, be able to signpost them and direct them, and have the resources to share with them. Really, the aim is to keep people in work, because the number of people who lose their jobs or they're off sick for long periods of time, we really need to be thinking about their financial security and stability as well, and supporting people to stay in employment and educating employers about how they can support people in the best way. With Check With Me First, we're carrying on with that, really open to delivering those workshops. Again, providing the NHS professionals and NHS workers with understanding around how experiencing childhood trauma like sexual abuse can impact on access to healthcare, and the fact that very many survivors will avoid things like cervical smears, prostate checks, even mammograms, even just going to the dentist or the optician can be something that feels really fearful for a victim and survivor. Just having someone really close to you, being in a prone position, lying back in a dentist chair, all of those things get in the way. And we know that, survivors do suffer with increased health conditions, and they need to be accessing that kind of care for themselves. What was the next one, Chris? You asked me about
Act on ICSA, and then I'm adding your conference on as well.
Okay, Act on ICSA. We are gearing up to get people to write to their MPs to ask them to support the implementation of the independent inquiry's recommendations. And in particular, we really want to see a child protection agency and a minister for children. We really need to have different structures in place to the ones that have currently and in the past been in place, because they're the ones who've messed up generally.
100%.
Something different, please. So yes, that's something that we'll be putting out through our networks and on our website to just encourage people to start getting in contact with their MPs to ask them, what are you doing about this? When are you going to do something?
Yeah.
And now, what about your conference? Tell us all about that, Fay.
So our conference is 19th and 20th of September, and we've put together what we think is an interesting and varied and supportive program. So one of the things we wanted to do was build in some self-care. We've already talked about that. We're people attending will most of the time be people who are working in the sector. So we've invited yourself, Chris, to come and run some sessions for us and to talk about nutrition. We've got we're going to have sessions specifically around self-care and looking after yourself when you're working with survivors. We're planning a nice dinner on the 19th. So for people who've been at the conference, it's not here's the end of day one, see you tomorrow, but it's about coming together as people who are working with survivors and supporting survivors, and finding the time to have some downtime while you're doing that. We've got a brilliant lineup of speakers, as well as yourself. Jess Phillips has agreed to come and open the conference for us. And although Alexis J can't be there in person, she's going to dial in to give a keynote presentation for us.
Duncan's there.
Duncan is going to give us a keynote on working in prisons, and we have Professor Bradbury coming along to talk about the Prosper research study, which really looked at how specialist voluntary sector services are working and the value of what they bring. And that's brilliant. Just, we've also got a sound bath. So we will have a sound bath at the end of day one for people who like to do things like that.
I love that.
And I'm aiming to get some canine support coming in, as an additional looking after ourselves measure.
Yeah,
so yes,
brilliant. Sounds
fantastic.
Really good. Beverley, any questions?
Yeah, well, I am going to say we have overrun, but I let that carry on because it flowed so nicely. So I've always loved speaking to Fay anyway, and it's so good. And the training that you were speaking about, we will be covering more with Linda Lewis, because she's going to be coming on and speaking about abuse within the workplace. So that's something we'll be following on for anyone that's interested to hear more about that. But I think it's really last thoughts now, because anybody listening, it's like there's been so much information, which is fantastic, and it's a great opportunity to speak to Fay again. So if anybody's listening and they've got any additional questions, please, you can contact us by adding comments below the video, or if you're listening to us on an audio, you can email us at breakingthecycle2stepforward@gmail.com. We will, of course, be putting the Survivors Trust link underneath as well. So if you've got more questions you'd like to ask Fay, also, most importantly, if there's anybody listening and you are a survivor yourself and you've never actually spoken to anybody, please reach out to either ourselves or the Survivors Trust, and we can signpost you. You're not alone. We wouldn't want you to be alone, and everything happens at your pace and your choice. So on that thought, Fay, what's your last thought for the day before we say goodbye?
I think my last thought is it's been a pleasure talking to you both, and I think it's talking to people who have things in common in terms of their understanding and approach and wanting to support survivors. So thank you for inviting me.
No, it's always a pleasure. And Chris, for yourself, what's your last thoughts?
Well, I'm pinching Fay's line from the last podcast, and I'll just remind you, Fay, what you said. We are not going anywhere, and we will continue to make noise.
Absolutely. And my last word I would say is anger is very much related to passion. And I think that is exactly what we all have. We have passion about wanting to make change, about stopping the silence. Silence only exacerbates abuse. It doesn't stop it. And we're not about to be silenced.
Never.
So we're just drawing this podcast to a close then, Bev.
Absolutely. You took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you so much, everyone. And time to say goodbye. That's the end of this podcast. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. See you in the next one.